This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
I do this often with people that have never been on the Melt before, and I just want to, because I like to provide context and not just have somebody on strictly for their information.
Sure.
If you could tell the listeners and the people watching how it was that you came to the place where you either started researching or experiencing the sorts of things that we're about ready to talk about in this conversation. What brought you to these subjects, and what took you deeper into them?
Yeah, wow, that's a really interesting question. Ever since I was a child, I've had something that I recognize now as called claircognizance, where I could know pieces of information without knowing how I knew it. And I knew it with certainty to be true. Like, for example, I remember the first time I ever heard about Atlantis, I was a small child. And I asked my dad about it, and he said, oh, yeah, Plato wrote about it. It's an allegory, blah, blah. It's not real. And I was like, that is not true. And he was like, yeah, it is true. And I said, no, it really existed. And I was just certain of it. And he was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. I just knew he was wrong. Also, the first time I heard about multiple people killing Kennedy and not just the standard story, my dad said, oh, and he was mocking conspiracy theorists and stuff and talking about how super specialized they were. And he was like, and there's one of them that they believe that some guy signaled with an umbrella, which now I know is absolutely 100% true. And my dad was just dead wrong. And I knew that he was wrong. And I just was always sort of fascinated in what I now, as the main thing I do for a living is I'm a Vedic astrologer. I now know that it's what's called 8th house information. So the 8th house in Vedic astrology, it represents, Western as well, but more so in Vedic, it represents the mystical, the occult, the hidden. It's really kind of the common surface area between the spiritual realms and the physical realm and how they interface. There's transcendent spirituality, which is 12th house. That's like Buddhism, right? Or Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism. And then there's 9th house, which is traditional religion, right? Which is considered very beneficial and good. Whereas 8th house is considered negative, and so is 12th house. They fear the negatives to the material circumstances that come with those houses. But all occult and esoteric conspiracy theory, all this kind of stuff is 8th house. And I had a very powerful 8th house. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that if you're unconscious of the so-called trick or negative 3 houses, the 6th, 8th, and 12th house, then you experience them in the 6th house, you experience it as illness and enemies, right? But if you have a powerful 6th house, you could also become a doctor, a surgeon, right? Or maybe you work with the criminals in the halfway house. And it's like you have 10,000 volts of energy that has to come through, and you either experience it unconsciously, illness and enemies, and it draws your attention to that house. That house's sort of portfolio of karmic unfoldment, right? But if you experience it consciously, then you can bring that 10,000 that must come through and channel it in a positive way. So I teach people how to hack their chart, right? How to convert that karma from unconscious to conscious, right? And so I have a very powerful 8th house, and I experience all kinds of hidden, like, abuse and negative, horrible things, right? And like my best friend committed suicide when I was 17, right? And just loss of friends. I had friends who ripped me off because my 11th lord of friends is in the 8th house. But I've always had an interest in the occult, the esoteric, and the hidden since I was a child. When I turned 40 and you switch from your natal chart to your Navamsa chart, my 8th house is even more loaded in my Navamsa second half of life chart. Mm-hmm. And I realized in 2020, I'd had a nervous breakdown doing social work that I just really needed to lean into this. And that's when I started to go really deep and my life really changed in a positive way. That said, what woke me up was 9/11. I figured out on 9/11 that evening, my friends and I love to tell this with a specific thing, which only OG Gen X gaming nerds would understand this reference. Mm-hmm. But there was a game called Warcraft 2. Mm-hmm. It's where World of Warcraft, the very famous MMO, comes from. Warcraft 1 and Warcraft 2, which are real-time strategy games where you build bases and you either pump out elves and dwarves and men or orcs and goblins and ogres and whatever, right? And I said to my friends when I realized that there was no air defense around the Pentagon, I said, I used the Socratic method, which was devastating to them, but then they quickly grabbed a frickin' Costco-sized jar of blue pills and guzzled it till they were just buried in blue pills. I said to them, what's the first thing you do in Warcraft 2 besides make guys to go get the gold mine and harvest wood? And they said, well, you got to build arrow towers. And I said, why? And then he goes, Ian, why are you asking this? You already know. Because you need that static ground to air defense. Because if the other guy hyper builds quickly without making any troops just to get to dragons or griffin riders, they just come over and they wipe out everything in the ground. And there's basically nothing you can do. The little archers in the ground aren't good enough to kill a dragon breathing on you. You have to have an arrow tower, which will take out the dragon before the dragon can take it out. And I said, yeah, right? You have to, right? You have to have air defense. And they said, yes, Ian, where are you going with this? And I said, where was the air defense at the Pentagon? And they said, what? And I said, surely they have pop-up surface-to-air missiles there, yes, or else the Russians would have taken us out decades ago.
Exactly.
And they all looked down, and the blood drained out of their face. And then one of them goes, no. Got really angry and said, that would mean the government's involved, and there's no fucking way. Oh, pardon my language there.
Oh, and cuss away.
Yeah, but there's no fucking way. And I said, I agree with you. It would seem to strongly imply that, but that doesn't resolve my question. Where was the air defense? And they just got super mad and were like, just stop talking about it. Like, today's upsetting enough. Just stop with your bullshit and your conspiracy theory nonsense. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay. And then a couple of weeks later, my weed dealer says, hey, have you guys heard about any of these 9/11 conspiracy theories? And I was like, oh my God, thank you. Because for weeks, I like started thinking about it more. And I started to think about, I'd read William Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse, and I've been thinking about that. And when this guy said it to me, he introduced me to Mike Rupert. I don't know if you know who that is, cop versus CIA voice in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. No. So he's an LAPD guy who discovered while working the LAPD in the 80s that the CIA was funneling cocaine into the gangs, and that fueled the crack epidemic, right? Mm-hmm. He actually got John Deutsch. He confronted him when they came to LA and confronted him with Freedom of Information Act stuff that more or less proved this. And the CIA director was caught on the spot, and he couldn't even neither confirm nor deny. He basically got caught by Mike Rupert. And then Mike Rupert had a whole 9/11 timeline that he came out with. And he was legitimate. He was good and ended up dead under kind of mysterious circumstances, like many years later. And then I recalled about William Cooper of Behold a Pale Horse fame. And I went and I found that he had put out a podcast in January of 2001 saying there's going to be, now that Bush is in, there's going to be a terrorist attack. It's going to be blamed on the third world. Someone in the third world, probably Osama bin Laden. And he says it's coming. And then I got caught up with him. And just as I was getting caught up with him, he fucking died. The SWAT team killed him.
Right in his front yard, right?
In his home, yeah, in his home. Mm-hmm. And then he had been saying, and this is where we can get into Luciferians and Molochians here in a minute, right? Very relevant to this point I'm about to make. Mm-hmm. He had said for years that Alex Jones was an intelligence agent asset, right? And Alex Jones is very small. And at first, William Cooper liked him and took him under his wing because William Cooper's was a boomer. And Alex Jones, like you and I, is Gen X, right? And so at first he tried to take Alex Jones under his wing, thinking he was a fellow patriot, all this kind of stuff. But then he suddenly sniffed out, and you can find, although it's very hard to find, the only one I can find has all sorts of anti-Semitic symbolism on it that like ruins the impact of the video, right? Yeah. That just which is the only version of this I can find the audio anywhere. But there's audio of him going through his list of reasons of why Alex Jones is clearly suspect, right? He gets killed, and Alex Jones basically takes over all of his audience because Alex Jones was saying very similar stuff, but with certain very heavy missing pieces in it for a long, long time. Although Alex Jones has actually come around on some of those missing pieces in the past year or two, which again kind of dovetails into the Luciferian versus Molochian thing, which I know is the main thing you want to get into. So I also had, so after 9/11, I went through this whole sort of, I'd actually had a spiritual awakening before it because I actually had a vision in January of 2001 without the benefit of listening to Dude's show. I had a vision that had all kinds of stuff. And I had been taking a Religions of India class, and I read the Bhagavad Gita at the end of 2000, and I read the passage where Krishna and Arjuna are on the field of battle, and Arjuna says to Krishna, well, I don't want to kill my cousin. And he goes, well, you can't harm your cousin. He goes, what are you talking about? Like, we're on a frozen battlefield. Look, there's that arrow going through that guy's eye over there. Like, I'd say that guy's been pretty harmed by this interchange. And he says, oh, well, you mean the flesh? Sure, but not the Atman, because fire cannot burn it, sword cannot cut it, air cannot wither it, water cannot drown it, for the Atman is eternal, immortal, and changeless. And that is who your cousin truly is, and it cannot be destroyed. And I felt like this ringing going off on me. And that's the moment I mark my adult spiritual awakening. At the end of that semester, I had just got done with that class and with all my finals. And I had, for the 2 weeks, I had not smoked weed because it was finals and I had to get all these papers done. And I also hadn't eaten in like 2 days. And weed and blood sugar interact in a very important way. That's why people get the munchies. And so when I smoked the weed, basically my blood sugar dropped to cratered to nothing, and my body thought I was dying, and so it released the psychedelic aspect of weed. And so I smoked it, and I smoked 2 huge Sobe Bong rips, and I was trying to play Mario Kart with my friends, and I just kept slamming into the wall, and they were shooting me turtles and mocking me. And I was like, I can't play, guys. I'll just watch you. And I was trying to watch on the couch, and I couldn't. And I said, I got to go lay down. And I went and laid down, and I had this insane, super intense vision that one of the things it showed me was that there would be what it showed me was I saw basically like a satellite view of the US, and right where New York was, I saw this huge like impact, like a stone being thrown into a still pond, and ripples came out of it. And those ripples turned into this black wave. And it went across, and I lived in the West Coast at the time. I mean, I still do, but I think that that's part of it, my mind interpreting symbol. And at the time, that was where the main resistance to the Bush administration, which back in those days, it was the right wing that was being used by the globalists to advance their agenda. Yeah. And everyone forgets that. All the right wingers who are so smug and I've always been right. No, you voted for Bush twice. Shut up. Yeah. Like, unless you were one of those 1 in a million right wingers that was against Bush and the way he was using the Muslims to scare them into giving up rights, unless you were against that because you're a true libertarian, you kind of don't have a lot of right to be talking smack to the lefties who are falling for the same trash based on partisan nonsense that you did 20 years ago, right winger. But anyways, so this wave of darkness came over, and there was this shining light that appeared in the West Coast, and it stopped it. And then in this black inky oil, there started to appear like those deep sea fish with the sharp teeth, the anglerfish and crocodiles and barracuda and stuff. Yeah, right, with the little thingy on the top. And they were kind of like biting around, and they were getting kind of aggressive with each other. And then the wave rose up, and it was much bigger this time, and it slammed again. And again, this light rose up and stopped it. And then it started like really like these fish started like swimming around, started attacking each other and so forth. And then it rose up way like out of the upper atmosphere of the earth, and it slammed once again. And again, this light rose up and it stopped it. But this time the blackness shook, and then it turned into light. And this voice said, and the light of humanity shall spread once more across the world. And this light just spread all the way around the globe.
Wow.
And so when then 9/11 happened, 9 months later, I realized, holy shit, where that impact was right where New York is on the East Coast. And I realized, wow, that's that thing I saw. And nobody, like, the conspiracy theory was bad enough, but me saying that, like, nobody was hearing that.
Of course.
And I also found, and again, I'll give a little doff of the hat here. Alex Jones had just done his, if I recall the timing correctly, had just done his Bohemian Grove thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that, and also James Shelby Downard's sorcery, sex, and assassination thing, which I actually got a copy of a book specifically to get that, where he mentions cybernetic mystery zombies as the final goal, and that like they were trying to MK Ultra the whole country with the JFK assassination. I basically discovered that Babylonian dark sorcerers ran the planet. And again, claircognizance, I knew it was true, even though it was the craziest fucking thing I'd ever heard in my life. When I discovered this in like October of 2001, I knew it was true. It was a very dark time for me and very alienating because everyone I knew thought I was nuts if I broached any of this stuff.
Did it make sense to you though when you thought that? As crazy as it sounded, on one level, was it like, of course, yeah.
I just knew it was true in the depth of my being, and the one saving grace to it was I realized there had to be a countervailing force of some time. At that point, I was very disliking. I was raised Catholic, and I was very disliking of. I've always loved Jesus, and I always loved the angels, and I liked Mary, and I also knew when I was a kid. Here's another example of claircognizance. When they would call Mary Magdalene a prostitute, I knew that was a lie. And it made me really angry for some reason I couldn't put my finger on. But I was pretty sour towards Christianity and Islam and Judaism at that point, and I haven't really super changed my tune on that, other than I realized there's good people and bad people in all three of those groups, you know, based on whatever level of consciousness they're on, which we can get into that in a minute. But it was very alienating because it was terrifying. Because for like probably basically until 2020, I was pretty convinced that we were fucked. I really thought that the best case scenario was that society could collapse into a Mad Max scenario. That was my good scenario. My bad scenario was they'll do a total holocaust to the planet and have total control, and there's no stopping them. Right?
So that got better. You thought we weren't fucked after 2020?
Correct.
That says something.
Because I saw people wake up for the first time.
Oh yeah.
And I suddenly saw that I could broach many of these subjects, and I had receptive audience. I had either extreme hate poured at me, but I had seen that show before. But I all of a sudden just found that people were questioning things in a way they never had before. And I would say that they're, you know, like, look at this dark sorcerer thing. I wouldn't say it's common knowledge, but even compared to 5 years ago, like, it's basically common knowledge. I would say there's 100 or 1,000, probably 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times as much awareness that there's this, you know, most people get it wrong and they think it's a satanic agenda and it's light versus darkness and that's it. And there's no more nuance or context. And that's where they get it wrong, right? Which we'll go into that here in a bit. But there's now an awareness that really wasn't there. The only other time there was a beginning of an upswing in awareness, ironically, which at the time I didn't like because I was on the brunt of it. I loved Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid, but it turns out that all that early 1980s satanic panic stuff was right on the money. All the right-wing stuff about feminism and all that kind of stuff, it turns out it was right that it was Frankfurt School of Communist people pushing this shit with a super multi-decade long-term plan. Go ahead, you're going to ask something.
No, I was just going to say, meaning that there was something actually to panic about.
Correct.
Yeah.
Here's what happened in my estimation. Going way back to, I can never remember his name. It's some long Islamic name, but the old man of the mountain who created the Hashishin, where the term assassin comes from.
Yes. I the name is on I can almost see
it's it. Ibn something or other. IBN is in
Hassan.
Hassan, Ibn something or other.
Yes, yeah.
Anyways, he developed mind control assassins. And what he would do is he would take a young, impressionable Muslim guy that probably had already had trauma, and he would have someone talk to him and drug him. And then the guy would wake up in this walled garden. And there would be, often there would be lots of hot women, right? Who would like sexually please the man, like a harem kind of thing. Yeah. And there would be I'm not sure exactly why he used this, but he himself would be buried in the ground up to his neck. And he would say, I am Allah. And if you do as I am about to instruct you, you will be given 20 virgins. And when you go to heaven. And he would then manipulate the person over the course of days who would keep getting drugged over and over and over again. He would manipulate the assassin into believing that if they did this, they would go to heaven and have all these virgins. And he also did something to where he made it kind of subconscious to where the person wasn't even entirely quite all the way aware of it. We don't know the exact methods. Probably someone does, but we don't know the exact methods. It's not available in the historical record. This general outline I just described is, but the specifics of the methods are unclear, right? But this is the first that I'm aware of recorded, documented mind control assassins, and they were incredibly effective, and they completely changed the Islamic world. I'm not even convinced this was, I don't know, that's too debatable to understand, but it had some very interesting impacts on the Islamic world, and then there's a connection between the Hashishim and the Templar that arises later, and very, very curious, strange bit of history. Centuries later, the Nazis would develop something called Project Marionette, where they discovered or rediscovered or fine-tuned trauma-based mind control. They discovered that if you tortured someone, that people will sometimes have their personality fragment and new personalities will rise in order to handle that. People dissociate, and then sometimes the personality fragment. And sometimes some of those personalities would be extremely amenable to conditioning. And they were creating mind control assassins that were not aware that they were assassins. And that was then brought over to the United States after the war in Project Paperclip. And that became the infamous MK Ultra, Sidney Gottlieb stuff, right? Where they were doing mind control using acid, right? LSD. They used it on Johns, and then that got out. So they couldn't do that anymore because it was even someone who'd been with a prostitute in film, they found was too credible. So eventually they moved into the California prison system. And that's where he was either recruited or he learned, but that's where, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Crazy guy with the swastika on his forehead. Charles Manson learned how to do his mind control stuff with people. And you got the Sharon Tate murders. And then eventually you get Bunny, what's her name or whatever her name was, who tried to assassinate Ford, right? Squeaky, right. That's right. Squeaky Froman. And there's weird, I don't want to go too much into this, but there's a weird thing where like there was someone who looked like Manson was under mind control because she would mouth everything he said before he said it on the stand. There's actually footage of this that she would mouth what he said before. And some people say that there was like even a psychic link because there's someone I won't mention. I refuse to mention. Please don't say his name if you know who I'm talking about. There's a reason why. But there's a very dark person who was involved in all this, and he wanted to not only do mind control assassins, he wanted to create people who were capable of spiritual attacks and even to attack computer systems with their minds. But around the time that they were starting to really perfect all this stuff, they discovered, to back it up, they discovered that even prisoners were too credible of witnesses. So they couldn't do it anymore in the California prisons. So they moved to satanic cults. And they were able to do multiple things there. They were able to have like a funnel for children who went missing in mass in the 70s. We've never had people talk about, oh, there's so many people are trafficked now. That's nothing compared to what was happening in the 70s in terms of population size. In the 70s was by far the most mass murders and by far the most disappearances of any decade, as far as I know. And what they did was they realized that they could farm out the mind control into these satanic cults, because imagine that you're Barney Fife, you know, and you stumble across this satanic cult killing children, right? And Epsteining them. And you go in and the guy goes, no, we're a CIA front. Please, like we were paid by the CIA. Nobody's going to listen to these people.
Yeah.
These people have zero credibility. They have such little credibility that it makes California prisoners look credible. So it was the perfect place to hide this.
Yes.
And that's why there was such a massive pushback. And that's why there was such a hubbub around it, is because it was farmed out all over the country. What happened was then they discovered psychotronic weapons and perfected those, right?
Yes.
Havana syndrome kind of stuff. And then almost all of this then disappears. And it disappears by like the mid 80s. There was no longer any use to use. There was no longer any need to use the satanic cults as a front for this operation. So the satanic panic in the 80s was on the money, except for it was missing this mind control CIA piece. The Christians who discovered it just saw that one layer. They also were able to sniff out that there was a magical component to it. That they understood. What they didn't understand was that intelligence was behind it. Because the thing is, remember how I talked about 8th house earlier? 8th house also rules intelligence agencies. So not always, but some vast majority of intelligence people are also interested in the occult.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Definitely.
And if you look at a lot of the intelligence agency insignias around the planet, they have tons of occult symbols in them. But go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say that I think the satanic panic helped to set the stage for the way that, for instance, the Epstein situation and others like it, pedophile rings, all the stuff you hear about in the news connected with Disney and everything else, helps us to write it off as, oh, it's just another sort of satanic panic sort of thing. Like these things are so ridiculous. There's no way they could exist because these people have no reference point in their own lives. And for the most part, they're good people. So they would never think somebody would be up to something like that. Just wanted to make that connection.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And we were talking about off camera before we started, that the Molochians, which we can launch into that here in a minute. I feel like I should tie off something you said earlier. We kind of got on a tangent, but I think it will be interesting to the listeners.
For sure.
Well, actually, I'm going to save that until we get into the Molochian versus Luciferian stuff. Just one last thing to tie it off. So I basically started doing Angelic Magick kind of. So actually going further back, after that experience of having that vision, 9/11 happened, all this stuff, I kind of went on the hippie trail, right? I was kind of like the neo hippies of the 90s and early 2000s kind of things, really children of boomers, like trying to recreate that 60s magic, right? Which now I recognize that even the counterculture was a CIA construct, blah, blah, blah. Although again, that one I think got out of hand and went in a direction they didn't entirely expect or want.
For sure.
Right. They going on this hippie trail, I went to something called a rainbow gathering back when that was still cool. The boomers wouldn't pass the baton to the Gen X. So the last time I went, I completely collapsed because a bunch of the boomers had died off. And since they would have, as boomers are wont to do, not let go of their white knuckle control of power and navel gazing, it kind of has fallen apart, unfortunately, because the boomers didn't pass on stuff to the Gen Xers. So afraid were they of even considering that they were getting older or passing on the baton, that they just let it all fall apart instead. Classic boomers. But anyways, so I went to this I went to this rainbow gathering, and I had this intense shamanic dream, which I won't go into here, just to take too long. And at the end of it, basically, I was rescued. It was like an underworld dream And much like Odin, when he hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, he went down into hell, into the lower astral. And when he came back, his body was jerking, from being strangled on the tree. And in the dust below his feet, his toes had written the Futhark, the magical rune system. So he brought back with him knowledge that could be used to advance and help humanity by going through a very dark journey. This is also shown by Scorpio, which goes down into the underworld, and that's why Scorpios get such a bad rap. I actually wonder if you're a Scorpio based on your shirt and your general demeanor, or have a prominent Scorpio.
I'm not.
But okay, interesting. But so Scorpio goes down through the underworld, and then it comes out as the eagle, right? The ancient symbol for Scorpio is actually the eagle, and then that eagle alights on the staff of Ophiuchus, the serpent holder. But that's talking about the journey through the underworld that then allows you to fly, right? You go through this crawling thing upon the ground, but having survived the underworld and being transmuted by that, Pluto force, then you rise again as the eagle, and you have like knowledge for having survived that. And a lot of like really wonderful people who have a lot of depth are like me and have survived really horrible experiences. I had a very, very, very horrible childhood, and it gave me a lot of the compassion, and it gave me a lot of the understanding of others that helps me to be a healer today. Like I learned it, that Chiron wounded healer journey. And so I had this underworld dream, and then I was sort of stuck in this lower astral hell realm space, and I called upon Archangel Michael, which I hadn't even really thought about Archangel Michael in decades. I just instinctively, since I was a kid, I'd always liked Archangel Michael and all the stained glass I'd seen him and stuff. My middle name's actually Michael. And I called upon Archangel Michael, and he came down with a firing sword and rescued me. And then in the dream, it was snowing, even though it was summertime. And I woke up puking, and I was at very high elevation in Utah, and it was snowing, just like had happened in the dream, which was pretty wild. And the next day, this person who was camped right near us, because we didn't have time to go down into the main thing, we had to camp in our van. They said, "Hey, last night, Archangel Michael was flying around. Did you see that?" And I was like, "What?" Because I didn't say anything to them. They just said that to me. And I was like, "That's interesting." And then I was walking down in the camp with my pack on. This woman came up and was hugging everyone. They always say, welcome home when you go to these things. And she gave me a hug, and she said, "Welcome home. By the way, Archangel Michael walks behind you." And I was like, "What?" And she didn't say it to anybody else in my group, just to me. And I was like, "That's very odd."
Yeah.
And then I was walking down, I set up my tent, and I just felt pulled almost like a magnet to this clearing. And I saw this man, and he looked just like Gandalf. This guy's like 6'3" or 6'4", big, long white beard, gray beard and gray hair. And his head whipped up when I entered in the clearing. Like, he was quite far from me, and his head, he just turned, and he motioned me over, and I went over to him, and he was wearing this Japanese, World War II Japanese hat that they had, which is basically like a baseball cap with little ear flaps. And it said shaman on it. It literally said shaman on it. And he told me someone had given it to him. But this guy was a literal Siberian shaman. Like, he was from that lineage. Like, his family's from, I think it's Kamchatka. And he was half Siberian shaman and half Inuit. And he was actually albino. And he was just this gigantic guy. He was like 6'4". Like I said, I mean, he literally looked like Gandalf. And he said to me, "Archangel Michael is with you, and you're very powerfully in tune with him, and you're going to be my apprentice." And I was like, okay, what is happening right now? And so I actually did apprentice with him for a few months, and he taught me some really interesting stuff. And he was the first person that said to me, and this is kind of a perfect segue into the main thing you want to talk about. He said to me at one point, he said, the number one thing that we as like white magicians, right, have to do, and what shamans all over the world are aware of and that we all fight against, is pedophilia. He said, the reason for that is he said, thousands of years ago, he said many thousands of years ago, about 6,000 years ago, there were these dark magicians, and they were consorting with demons. And the demons told them there's a greater power that you haven't yet accessed. And they said, what? We know all there is to know about the dark arts. And they go, oh, no, not everything. There's a much greater power. It's the greatest power, in fact. And they said, well, I want to contact this power. And they said, well, there's only one way. you have to Epstein the children.
Mm-hmm.
And that arose in the dark temples of the Near East, child sacrifice and pedophilia. And he said it opens a gateway to the lower astral. And then through that, this ancient demon god can reach through and touch the world and taint minds of these powerful priesthood. And that priesthood is who runs the world. And he said that this is the number one thing. So we must eradicate pedophilia. And when we do, that will slam that gateway to the lower astral shut. And then that being won't be able to touch the world anymore. And it's the number one thing that must be ended on earth above all else. And if that's ended, then everything will change for the better. He didn't use the term Moloch, but Moloch exactly fits the bill of what he's talking about. And I'm sure there is a Sumerian equivalent, right? And a Babylonian equivalent to Moloch. But I like the term Moloch because it's in the Bible. And it also shows that the enemy of the Jewish people were the Moloch worshippers that were to the north in Tyre, in what's today modern Lebanon. And they would later be found in Carthage. And this is where the whole black nobility thing comes in, which I'm not going to, for reasons I mentioned. I have a whole video series on that. And also Philip Jimenez, who I interviewed, is starting to talk about that more. And he actually knows more of the historical stuff. Suffice to say, in those videos, which you can watch on my channel on White Lotus of Light on YouTube, I feel I've proven, probably not beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I've proven more than enough for me after searching for decades to who runs the planet. That's who it is. And I proved that, in my opinion anyways, that these people worship Moloch specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that term because it has a very dark vibe to it. Their own name for it is Haman Baal, but that doesn't have the same energetic component, because I think that term being in the Bible, which to me, Satan just means the adversary. That's all it means. And who's the adversary of the Jews? The biblical, like David and stuff. What's the Moloch worshippers?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know? Because when Solomon is foolish enough, the God's like, yeah, go ahead, enslave the demons and make your badass temple. Go nuts. Have some astrologers. That's fine. Learn magic. That's great. No problem. Oh, you want to marry 1 million wives? That's fine. Good. Keep going. No problem so far. But then he marries a woman from Tyre, right? Who is, Hiram Abiff, who designed, of Masonic lore, who designed Solomon's temple, right? The temple builders who knew all the sacred geometry stuff, they came from Tyre and brought their craftsmen and their knowledge of how to build sacred geometry, amazing temples.
Mm-hmm.
That was all fine, but the problem was he married a woman from Tyre, and she begged him to let her worship as she wanted to. And so he said, okay. And she set up a temple on the outskirts of Jerusalem to Moloch. And that's when Solomon fell from grace.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear to me that's the adversary, right? And it ties into this shaman who didn't use those terms at all. He wasn't interested in any of that. Mm-hmm. He wasn't particularly fond of the Abrahamic religions, though he did say that a lot of the people in the Abrahamic religions are opposed to this force, right? Which I think is true. He didn't use that term at all. He said an ancient Near Eastern demon god. That was the term he used. Mm-hmm. It's the same being. It has to be, because it's the only being that demands that form of worship,
of child sacrifice. And
the pedophilia is the critical part.
Yeah,
actually, because it reverses the flow of the Kundalini. The sacrifice is almost a mercy at that point once you've done that to someone.
Sure. Okay.
The sacrificing that matters is the sacrificing of their innocence in the reverse. I mean, it's like when you think about it, as bad as killing those children is, and that's certainly horrific beyond imagination,
mm-hmm.
what they do to the children beforehand is much worse. It's much worse. Yeah. It's far more damaging.
For sure. And especially if they're allowed to live after that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that
they
makes
probably wish for death.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? And it does activate you psychically, which that person whose name I will not mention
mm-hmm.
earlier, he pushed that during the 70s, 80s child abuse stuff that was happening because he knew that it massively activates you psychically because it reverses the Kundalini flow, tends to cause dissociation, so astral projection, and it activates you psychically in a very powerful way. So that's part of what they're doing is they're also trying to torture people into becoming dark magicians who are very in touch with the spirit realm.
Yeah.
That's part of their goal here is to create future priesthood and dark magicians. So it's phenomenally evil. I mean, it's much more evil than it just even is on the surface. And it's really the one thing that unites all of humanity is our hatred, our instinctive hatred of that.
Mm-hmm.
There's an instinctive, you don't need to explain it to someone why it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that's just so intuitive, right? Like there's a time and a place where murder is justified. Killing is justified. Even premeditated killing, perhaps, right? You know they're going to kill you. You have proof. You get to them first, right? It's murder, but they're like you can justify it. There is no justification for that kind of harm of children. Mm-hmm. None. Either one. But it's just so incredibly egregious, and that's why they use it for blackmail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Although what confuses me too is that it seems like they're simultaneously, or someone is simultaneously trying to normalize it, trying to make it be. Yeah. So how does that work together? No, I was just to me, if that holds such power so that they can blackmail and get people cornered into situations where they have to basically do their bidding. Normalizing it seems like it would take that energy away.
It would, but their fantasy is total forever control and everything frozen, right? That's what the Great Reset is all about, which is the Molochian plan, right? Because these people that most people call Satanists are Molochians. The thing is that people confuse Luciferians for Molochians. And that's one of the big mistakes that people make, and it's a lot. It's where they don't have subtlety. And so, let me see if I can do a share screen row here to give this up, and I'm just going to go ahead and present this particular part. Let's see, how do I do that? Okay, present. Let me first. I got to open it up. I do apologize for those listening that this is paused for a second here, and I always kind of stumble with, in particular, StreamYard. I have this problem when I do live streams. So let's see, share screen. Don't show these tips again. Share screen. Oh my goodness. It's so complicated.
I know, it's so unintuitive.
We have to hit so many different things. Okay.
Oh, here we go.
All right. So one of the things I do is I do Angelic Magick, and I started doing that in 2020. And I happen to be, by the grace of the Most High, I happen to be very, psychic, right? I have a very prominent 8th house in both of my charts, and I'm just very psychic. And so doing Angelic Magick, I eventually got really in tune with the angels. I've actually worked my way up through the nine choirs and 3 spheres of the angels. It goes angels, archangels, principalities, virtues, powers, dominions, Ophanim, cherubim, and seraphim. And I've actually worked my way up through all 9 spheres, all 9 choirs and all 3 spheres. And the angels have presented me with a lot of information. I recognize that people are just going to have to either suspend disbelief or not believe me or whatever. It's anecdotal, but they have presented me with this model. And it basically says that there's 3 major levels of consciousness which have overlap. They correspond with actual worship of these actual deities, but the vast majority of humans on this planet, with the possible exception of Most High worship, don't openly or knowingly worship these energies. They just happen to vibrate at that frequency of consciousness. And so the core trait of Molochians, this group that I talked about, is self-hatred. And then they externalize it outwardly and they want to destroy. And you can see that at the lowest ebb is there's these traits that are purely Molochian, and there's no crossover with the other ones. And that's this hive mind. You see it all the time with the liberals. And you did actually see it in the early 2000s with the pro-Bush right-wingers, as we discussed earlier. There's dead materialism. That's one of their favorite things, because when you believe that you're one and done, then you get very fearful, and then it's very easy to manipulate you. It's blackpilling. Mm-hmm. It's a really egregious outlook, and I don't understand how anyone gets out of bed in the morning and doesn't just end themselves if they have that true belief that it's one and done. Like, my God, I couldn't live in this world if I had that belief. I feel for people trapped with that.
I think some people get off on infecting that mindset to other people, like bringing other people down to their level.
Yeah. The hive mind.
Yeah.
So there's slavery, right? Like overt slavery. Epstein-style harm of children is the absolute lowest ebb. Physical torture, parasitism, chaotic duality. And that means that you're either with me or you're against me. Things are black and white. That's actually Molochian consciousness to believe that. And that's why whenever people say, oh, those people are demons, we have to wipe them out. Well, who are you working for when you say that? Moloch. Mm-hmm. It just works for Moloch. Oh, but I'm on the force of good. Yeah, that's what everybody thinks when they go and kill the other people. They always think they're on the force of good, and they're always wrong as they commit these atrocities. So parasitism, things like creating money out of thin air and then charging interest, right? Might makes right. That's like a big core trait, right? Like the only way that you can have any kind of stability in society is people fearing Hobbes' Leviathan, that you'll just be killed and destroyed. So it's a fear-based system with no anything other than might makes right. There's no morality. There's no ethics. There's just whoever has the biggest club wins. And material stagnation for humanity. They really don't like the advancement of humanity. So you see things like the emperor in China finds out that there's in 250 BC, they made a repeating crossbow, which would have completely changed world history. He recognizes that it's dangerous. And he says, hey, guy who invented this, who knows about this? Oh, just me and my apprentice here. Oh, really? No other plans? Nothing? Well, I brought you the originals. Oh, okay. Execute that man. And then they throw that in the room. They found all kinds of things, water clocks, all kinds of stuff in the imperial palace when they had the communists take over the Forbidden City. They found that like the emperor had completely stagnated any material advancement for like thousands of years in China in order to prevent an uprising. Mm-hmm. So, or keeping people in the dark ages in Europe where people are just throwing poop in the streets. Now, where it gets interesting is there's crossover with the next level of consciousness, which also does sometimes have people who overtly worship Lucifer. The Molochians try and actually hide the fact that there's any spirituality because they want that all for themselves. So they try and actually push on most people the dead materialism. They have a much smaller clique that understands that there's a spiritual nature to things. The Luciferians are not that way, as we will see. But they agree with Moloch on hierarchy, conquest, competition, desire for power, and being utterly ruthless. And they'll kill. They won't hesitate to kill, much like the Molochians. So this is part of the reason that people mistake Luciferians for Molochians is because they see this dark energy, and they also feel that these Luciferians like have this darkness in them. The difference is the Molochians have this quality of being a monster stuffed into a suit. Think of people like Klaus Schwab, right? Or in a sweater. Think of or George Soros, or David Rockefeller. They just look like someone stuffed a monster into a suit. That's what they radiate, the energy. Compare that to people like Elon Musk, Donald Trump, right? These are people, Russell Brand, Joe Rogan. It depends on how they're dressed, but they tend to have kind of a gesture quality to them, or they're very genteel. They're very genteel, and they feel a bit like a cobra that's ready to strike. You don't quite trust them, and you're not sure why, but they have kind of like a much more approachable energy to them, even though they feel dangerous. And they have this cloak of what's called Luciferian confusion around them. And so both people who are aligned or vibrate with the Molochian energy and people who vibrate with the Most High energy, they mistake Luciferians for Molochians. And so you will see that then the purely Luciferian traits are enlightened self-interest, rule of law over man, meritocracy, and honoring of contracts, legal systems, right? They're like, let's rise up out of the muck, but we still are very ruthless and competitive with one another. Mm-hmm. And their core trait, the Luciferians, is narcissism, which is better than self-hatred, but it's a false light. The Molochians want to destroy God. The Luciferians want to replace God with mankind. Very different. So on the higher edge of the Luciferian consciousness, you have cooperation, advancements in the arts and sciences, the spiritualization of humanity. They're behind the New Age movement, whereas the Molochians don't like that at all. They don't want people to know that there's higher powers. Mm-hmm. They believe in the improved material well-being of humanity, liberty, and free will. unless you're in the game and fighting them. And then they'll use all manner of subterfuge to screw you over, and ruthlessness if you're at that level of consciousness. And then you see the Most High. That's the core trait of self-love, to love thy neighbor as thyself, which Yeshua said was the core teaching, right? So there you see that lower ebb, which we already talked about, cooperation, advancements in arts and sciences. But you see this all is one, all is God, non-hierarchical union. People will have different traits, of course, but all of it's beautiful. All that difference is beautiful. Not some forced fake diversity, which is just an inversion the Molochians use, but actual like beauty and diversity. Perfect trust. There's no need for contracts anymore. You have perfect trust, right? Symbiosis, that's working together, in a way that's mutually beneficial. Harmonious duality, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, the energies that drive the universe. Individuated telepathy. Instead of a hive mind, everyone can communicate, but while retaining their individuality. And then innocence is protected. And you see how there's like a mirror image of all the most negative traits of Moloch are reversed. Innocence protected is the most important, highest thing, protecting children. And the Epstein-style harm of children is the lowest ebb of consciousness. And so when you see things as levels of consciousness that we're advancing through collectively, and then you tie that to the Hindu concept of the yugas, things start to make a lot more sense. So I had on a guest named Bibhu Dev Misra on my show, who's an Indian scholar. He used to be a software engineer, so he just has that very analytical kind of mind. And he decided to study sacred texts, and he became perplexed by that there didn't seem any clarification on the Yuga system. So the Yugas believe that many people have heard of a golden age. What they don't realize is that most people is that golden age is called Sat Yuga or Satya Yuga. And then there's Treta Yuga, which is a silver age. And there's a golden age, which is both ascending and then descending. And then there's a descending silver age. In fact, I even have a chart on this as well. This would be good to show people as well. Just because this visual, I think, will help, especially visual learners. Let me see. I got to real quick find the person. But anyways, once you understand that we go through this cyclical process of different stages of consciousness that is sort of like writ large for humanity, then you suddenly are able to realize that this is all part of a much more complicated process. The trick is that you have to understand, and this is where one of the many ways that I will lose any kind of Christian viewers is that you have to have the frame of reincarnation in order for this to make sense and not be horrific. So going back to that Atman thing I said earlier. So there's this 25,800 year cycle, and it just so happens to match the great year, the astrological great year. You often hear, oh, we're entering the age of Aquarius. Well, that is the astrological great year, right? Like at the beginning of Pisces, Jesus appears, and then he says, oh, look for the water bearer when you enter my house, right? And he's referring to the upcoming age of Aquarius, right? Which we're now in, according to some Western astrologers, but we're moving into it according to Vedic astrology. So if you look here, you see there's two different Satya Yugas, and those are the golden age, and then there's a cataclysmos and interregnum period, and then there's the Treta Yuga, which is the silver age, and then there's the Dwapara Yuga, which is the bronze age descending. Then there's a descending Kali Yuga, then there's an ascending Kali Yuga. Then he theorizes there's an ekpirosis interregnum stage, and then it goes to Dwapara Yuga, ascending bronze age, ascending silver age, ascending golden age, descending golden age, and then it just continues endlessly. This process allows our souls to evolve. And what the angels have told me is that during the Kali Yugas, Moloch rules. And if you look at the past 6,000 years of history, it's pretty hard to dispute that the forces of darkness have dominated.
Exactly.
Right? You really have to go back to the early Old Kingdom of Egypt to have any records. And we have almost no records anywhere on Earth of a time period before this, even though the evidence is all around, hotly disputed. But the evidence is all around of things like Göbekli Tepe, which clearly civilization is much, much older than is commonly acknowledged. So the Satya Golden Age would have been Atlantis. The Cataclysmos would have been Graham Hancock's aerial bombardment twice, 1,000 years apart roughly, of the Younger Dryas impact, right? I tend to go with, some people think it's a micronova from the sun. I'm open to that, but I just kind of like Graham Hancock's model. It just kind of fits more for me that there's a cometary bombardment that happened. That also aligns with the astrological great year. It's always on the cusp of fixed signs that we have this stuff according to Randall Carlson's work. And then you have Treta Yuga. And so what Bibudev Mizra did was he discovered that right on the edge of Treta Yuga, right at the end of Treta Yuga, that's the empire of Rama. And he said that it's actually written about from stuff that came back with Alexander from the conquest of India, but it's also in certain Indian sacred texts. They call him Rama, and we called him, Bacchus, like the Bacchanalian. And so once he realized that, and that you could see it in the Greek texts of a time period, and you could see it in the Vedic, he's like, there's my anchor point. And by looking at a bunch of different like catastrophes and stuff happened, he was able to rectify those yugas. And I think he got it. I was not satisfied, did not like, with all due respect, and I have nothing but respect for Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's teacher. His model made no sense to me that the Kali Yuga ended in 1700. I'm like, hello, the Holocaust, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. Does that really sound like we're out of Kali Yuga? Yeah, if anything, pedophilia, as you pointed out, is on the rise, right? And then the same thing with Steiner's model. Again, deepest respect to Steiner. What the angels have told me is that they both were given incorrect information because people at that time needed that white pill to survive. And that they were given incorrect information, and that's why Bibudev Mizra's explanation is a bit simpler and more mundane. He has the internet, they didn't, right? So he has all these sacred texts at his fingertips, and he could cross-reference them and then rectify the system, and he matched it to the great year, right? Sri Yuktefar's thing like wobbles and doesn't make sense. It doesn't rotate correctly with the great year. Bibudev Mizra's does. And it matches Randall Carlson's extinction level event stuff. So I'm convinced he solved it.
Sure. Just an aside question about the yugas themselves. Do they only apply to the physical world, or do these apply to all realms?
They apply to the Earth. I believe they're unique to the Earth, the planet Earth, because the system would be different. If you were in an inner part of the spiral arm, you would have a much shorter cycle. Right? Because we're way out on the edge of the spiral arm of the galaxy. And so for us, from our point of view, it's 26,000-ish years. If you were on a super inside that spiral, much like if you're on the way on the outside of a track versus the inside track, right? You're going to have a longer time around than the person who's running on the inside of the track because you're covering a greater distance. So in the inner spiral, it could be 20,000 years. It could be 15. I mean, it really depends on the distance. But it's about rotating around the galactic center. It's the great year. Yeah.
Many people talk about time not being a linear event, but something that's all time is happening simultaneously. This sounds like a linear way of diagramming time. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that concept. How does that map out for you? Do you think that
linear time versus non-linear time, or so? I think that's correct. The best analogy I've heard for it, because it is difficult to wrap your mind around it, is imagine that there's a mural that's as big as the Great Wall of China and is maybe 150 feet tall, maybe let's say 100,000 times as long as the Great Wall of China, just to make it truly vast. Where you are, you can't see all the mural at the same time. It exists at the same time, but you can only visualize a part of that mural, right? And you can only see so much of it before you would just die of old age, right? Like even if you were trying to take it up. So the one of the translations, or one of the ways of looking at the Mayan system, right, which I believe has that Atlantean, I believe it's Atlantean information, just like I think Vedic astrology comes from Atlantis. I think some huge amount of our knowledge comes from Atlantis, and it's just stuff that's like sort of come down to us, and we have a fragment of a fragment of a fragment of a fragment of the knowledge they had. You know, maybe in the Vatican Library and some Masonic or Templar caches, or hidden away in some Buddhist monastery or whatever. But as a general rule, like, we've lost almost everything. Like, the best records we have is from the Hindus, like, without question, that are openly available. And even that is clearly fragmentary in nature. One of the ways that the Mayans conceive of it is that time is a plate, and that their calendar isn't actually meant to, it's actually a map. It's meant for you to be able to understand where you are on the plate, as opposed to it's a calendar in the way we think of it, linear time. So I do actually agree, although I can't conceive of it, I intuitively know it to be true, that like the Roman Empire is right now. That would sort of explain retrocausation, of which the whole Mandela effect is a, you know, a kind of like, it's a difference between carpe diem and YOLO, you know, seize the day versus you only live once. It's the same thing, but one of them's the low IQ version YOLO, right? I feel like Mandela effect is a YOLO to the carpe diem of a more sophisticated nonlinear time understanding. But I think it's functionally irrelevant, right? Because we don't, it could be that at higher states of consciousness, we experience it more in that way. I mean, the other way of looking at things is that time doesn't exist. There's only now, right? That's what the mystics all say.
Yes.
And certainly from a psychological point of view, it's infinitely better when you can be in that present moment.
Absolutely.
So you asked a question a long time ago I didn't address, and it was, why are they moving in pedophilia out in the open? So what I've been told by the angels is, whenever we get to the end of Kali Yuga, which there's been many, Moloch always tries to take over. Moloch operates best in the shadows because it's just so vile that the vast majority of humans, even in a Kali Yuga, will reject it, right? That's why, like, even in the ancient world where people were profoundly nasty as a general rule, they would come across the Moloch worship stuff and they'd be like, whoa, we're way into genocide and war. We love war. We love genocide, and we might throw some babies from some city walls of our enemies and just kill like nuts and enslave people. But whoa, you guys are going way too far in these temples. You know, like, everyone was genocidal back then, pretty much, with the exception of like the Scythians, it seems, right? And maybe like pre-dynastic, early dynastic Egypt. But I mean, everyone's enslaving one another, killing one another. I mean, it's really bad back in the day. I hear people go, oh, things were better back. No, environmentally maybe, but we certainly weren't treating each other better. No. I mean, like, even as recently as like the late 1800s in Paris, they would put lamp oil on a cat and light it on fire. And that was entertainment. People would clap and applause to seeing a cat lit on fire run around the stage till it claps dead. That's so insane. Like, nobody would like that now, which shows that consciousness is rising. So you said, why would they put the pedophilia out there? Whenever they realize the jig is up, they always try and move it out public and just try and take over and try and lock everything down and freeze everything down. They want to freeze things and not let the wheel advance to the next stage. They want to freeze things. When they're in the middle of it, they feel very relaxed. They're like, yay, we can just harm kids all we want. Everyone's enslaving and killing one another. This is wonderful. Like, humanity's like throwing poop in the streets. This is amazing. I love this whole collapse of civilization thing. My God, as a Moloch worshiper, you know, like, they're just so deeply insane that they feel fine. But when they realize the jig is up, and that comes from Moloch down, then they try and overtly take over. And that's this great reset. That's this normalization of pedophilia. They're trying to get a brain chip in everyone, put everyone in a pod, having them eat bug paste and be ritually humiliated, maybe eat feces. I saw that. I guess it was a 10 years old article, but I just was like, what is it going to take for Democrat voters to frickin' get it? And the answer is, I don't think anything. I think personal tragedy alone will awaken people who are still asleep. That's it. And even that, there's no guarantee they'll double and triple down. Nope, I'm giving my kid another booster, even though my other kid died, you know. Like, it seems like there's no depths to which they will not get it. They refuse. Their pride is just too much.
Exactly.
It's too much for them to admit they were duped. They cannot do it. They would rather die, literally.